Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 55th webinar in the Offshore Wind Series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Layla Leshmawi, Senior Project Manager with NYSERDA's Offshore Wind Team, and it is my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Rebecca Williams with the Global Wind Energy Council. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Firstly, if you're experiencing any technical issues, please contact Adam Hauk at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Expert series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Slido feature to submit your questions. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a crucial component in achieving the state's goal of 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or a speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Williams. As Deputy CEO for the Global Wind Energy Council, Rebecca promotes and facilitates the rapid acceleration of offshore wind globally, working with and advising governments and other key stakeholders in Asia Pacific, Middle East and North Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and the Americas. She works to create the right market, policy, and regulatory framework for offshore wind to thrive, and leads all Global Wind Energy Council's offshore wind-facing work. Prior to her role at the Global Wind Energy Council, Rebecca worked for Renewable UK and was responsible for achieving landmark policy and regulatory changes in the UK market, as well as contributing to the establishment of the UK's highly successful offshore wind sector. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will now be handing things off to Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much, Layla, for the introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with the NYSERDA team today to talk to you a bit about the work that we're doing as the Global Wind Energy Council around the world, and also to talk more widely around the offshore wind sector and how we see the technology being deployed in many emerging markets around the world. So really excited to be here with you today to explain that in more detail. I'm also just going to get straight in there with a plug for the report that we have just published here at the Global Wind Energy Council, which is our landmark flagship yearly publication on offshore wind. So I'm going to expand on some of the themes from that report, but also would really entreat you to go and read that. Bit of light bedtime reading for you, I'm sure, later on this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the presentation now. I understand that we do have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, so looking forward to some engaged discussion as well around those themes, but excited to get into more detail with you now. If we move to the first slide, please. So firstly, just a bit about GWEC and moving on to the second slide. GWEC is the global body for the wind sector, so we represent the wind industry. And we represent the wind industry particularly at the global level and in emerging and maturing markets for wind. What do we mean by emerging and maturing? Well, this is different countries around the world, different markets who really want to be able to move forward with wind power within their economy and within their energy system. And we work closely with those different stakeholders. We also represent a huge swathe of companies that you see here on the slide. And we have a network of Renewables Association members from around the world that you can see there also represented to the right of this slide. We're really proud to be that global body representative of those associations around the world. Next slide, please. And just a little bit more about the activities that we do. So we concentrate on policy development and informing best practices within the policy sphere. We also bring together different businesses and convene those around shared challenges that we see in the wind sector, as well as doing things like business to business and peer-to-peer events and thought leadership opportunities. And we also provide information and education, our market intelligence offerings, as well as widespread global outreach. And we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a second or two. Next slide, please. So getting into the presentation in a bit more detail, I want to talk to you a bit more about what are the key trends that we're seeing at the moment, which are driving the system and driving the wind sector. So let's zoom out a little bit from offshore wind and take a bit more of a wider world view. And if we go to the first slide, please, in this section. So we're seeing two large global megatrends here at GWEC, at the Global Wind Energy Council. And the first of these megatrends that we're seeing is that we're really moving forwards into this next industrial revolution, which the IEA, the International Energy Agency, have coined or termed as the age of electricity. And so what does this mean? Well, we're seeing that there is widespread electrification happening in the global economy, and particularly we're seeing also the rise of clean energy superpowers. So countries which are really pushing forward with a large percentage of electricity covering their energy system. And when we look at this trend in a bit more detail, it's been driven by a range of factors, but particularly rapid uptake of electric vehicles, a trend for much larger amounts of cooling within the global economy and in specific countries, and also the role of data centers and electricity at an economy-wide level powering industry. So we're really starting to see that we're moving into this next section and this next industrial revolution. We go to the next slide, please. And the other key point is that it's renewable energy, which is really at the forefront of this modernization agenda. And you can see again some sources here from the International Energy Agency, which show the role of primarily wind and solar PV really pushing forward this trend of electrification as costs for those technologies have come down and as they've become much more widespread. You can see this trend out to 2035 here, but we continue to see a rapid acceleration of these technologies after that period, really heralding a new era of electrification, which has renewables at its heart. Next slide, please. And again, just expanding on some of those trends that I mentioned there, we're seeing this across a different range of sectors, driven by rapid uptake of EVs, EV trucks, different digitalization agendas, and also heating and cooling, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So the other mega trend that we're seeing is this trend for rising geopolitical uncertainty. And in terms of this trend, we're also seeing the effect of the long tail of the COVID pandemic, and also the continuing effects of commodity price spikes and gas price spikes in particular following the war in Ukraine. And actually what we also are seeing is that this agenda is rising in importance when it comes to the topic of energy security specifically, and also the topic of energy independence. So in this more geopolitically uncertain world, we're also seeing countries really starting to reevaluate, I would say, long-held partnerships and consider in this next period who their allies are on particular topics. We also see, and you can see this on the map here on the left, that 74% of the global population actually lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. And due to the effects and the memories of those that dash for gas following the invasion of Ukraine, we're really starting to see that this becomes a very strong primary driver for countries who are looking to lessen their dependence on fossil fuels and avoid the volatility of those energy methods. Next slide, please. So bearing those megatrends in mind that I just described, where does that leave offshore wind, and how is offshore wind responding to this context? The next slide, please. So in our report, we look at a stock take. So we're looking at the last year for offshore wind and how offshore wind sits within these global megatrends that I just described. So first of all, I think it's important to say that offshore wind has gone on a huge growth trajectory since the first turbines were installed in Denmark in 1991. And in our report, which is the last full year that we have data for, so the year ending 2024, the report published this year, we found that now total installations of offshore wind have reached 83.2 gigawatts. Last year, we had 8 gigawatts of new installations. And that brings us to, that was actually the fourth highest year for offshore wind, and brings the growth trajectory, like I said, to 83.2 gigawatts. If we move on to the next slide, please. So you can see in this slide also that we have captured some of those key statistics. 83 gigawatts means that that offshore wind is now powering 73 million households worldwide. You can see a bit more about our calculations there on the left, and creating thousands of jobs around the world, as well as providing significant economic value, both at a country level and then specifically a project and coastal community level. We also found, and going on to the next slide, that 2024 was actually a record year for offshore wind auctions, so for auctions awarded, and also that we had a record year for the amount of offshore wind that's under construction. So you can see there 56 gigawatts awarded globally in auctions and tenders in 2024, and also 48 gigawatts of offshore wind under construction globally last year. So it was a really big year for offshore wind, and I think those numbers of awarded capacity and capacity under construction globally really tell the story, which is kind of behind the numbers here. Next slide, please. Just going into a little bit more detail around this 8 gigawatts of new capacity. So where was that actually awarded? You can see a breakdown here of the different regions and countries and how those different markets have grown. So no surprises, we've seen China's historical role also in pushing forward offshore wind, and no surprises that China has added 4 gigawatts to the grid last year of offshore wind. That's the highest number of additions. We also saw that Europe commissioned 2.7 gigawatts, 1/3 of new additions. The UK added 1.2 gigawatts, and then Germany just under a gigawatt there. So we've seen the historical role of these markets, and we've also seen that these mature markets have added considerable capacity in the last year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, you can see the breakdown here of different countries. Within the capacity that's been awarded so far, we do see the strong role of China being the market leader here in terms of installed offshore wind. But what we see in the next period, if we go on to the next slide, is it's actually a couple more slides, but I'll come to this point in a second. But what we see now is an ever diversified set of countries who are installing offshore wind. So whilst those numbers are reflecting the last period, so reflecting 2024, in our wider forecast, we can really see that there's an additional number of countries that are coming through very strongly and deploying offshore wind at scale. So in those countries right now, it's about making sure that we get the right frameworks in place in order to push forward offshore wind. In this slide, I just want to take a moment to talk about cost as well. And we found in the report, when we're looking at the status of offshore wind now, that despite the macroeconomic volatility that we have seen, And we'll get on again to some of the drivers of that in a second or two. Offshore wind remains a very cost competitive technology when it's tracked against other similar forms of energy generation. Next slide, please. So then looking forwards, we just spent some time looking backwards there at the last year, but looking forwards about what's going to happen next and in our forecast. Despite some of these challenges that I've been discussing, we still expect offshore wind here at GWEC to sail past the 30 gigawatt number in 2030. It's 30 gigawatts of additions and 50 gigawatts in 2033. So we continue to see very strong growth, 15% compound annual growth rate there out into our forecast period. And I think the fantastic thing here that I was just mentioning is that towards the end of this forecast period, we can also start to see the countries that are new to offshore wind now deploying at scale and see those capacity additions starting to hit the numbers there. Next slide, please. Just taking a moment to look at Europe specifically. So again, Europe is still on course to exceed this 10 gigawatt milestone by 2030. And you can see that the European story has also been a story of moving into newer markets, into expansion. So we've got the kind of mature markets there in the earlier period of the forecast there, moving through into newer markets for offshore wind in that later period. Next slide, please. And we'll just skip over this one as well. Thank you. So then coming to the Asia Pacific region, which we really at GWEC see as the next growth engine of the offshore wind industry. What we continue to see in this region is that different regional markets, as I say, begin to rise. So in this breakdown, you can see that so far China has been the largest market historically. But as we see the sector expanding, we're also then seeing capacity come online in Japan, South Korea, and also then moving into Vietnam, Australia, the Philippines, and Taiwan. So these markets start to really grow in importance. And you can see there towards the end of that forecast period that we see China's share dropping, market share dropping as a result of that capacity coming online in those countries. Next slide, please. Just want to take a moment to touch on floating offshore wind. And this slide speaks to that trajectory specifically. So this is our forecast here at GWEC of what's happening with floating offshore wind into the future. And I think it's fair to say, again, because of some of the macroeconomic conditions that we have seen in the wider infrastructure sector, that the floating wind trajectory has slowed slightly, but we continue to see very strong growth for floating offshore wind towards the end of the forecast period. I think some of these challenges have perhaps pushed it out slightly, but we do continue to see that strong growth across this different range of countries here. And actually, I would say that on floating wind, and particularly in the Asia Pacific region, we are seeing a race to the top in terms of the countries that can move forwards floating offshore wind at scale quickest. So we see a lot of development on this in Japan, and we can come on to that in a bit more detail in a second. But also in South Korea, which has an advanced and complex supply chain. We also see the UK trying to push forward this technology at scale. And so really there is this strong global race at the moment for floating wind and the next steps in that technology. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the global momentum for offshore wind is strong. The fundamentals remain unchanged despite some of these macroeconomic challenges. And you can see here in this slide a quick summary of all the milestones that we've reached in terms of the emerging markets that I've been speaking about over the last period. So just in the last month, actually, the Philippines have announced that they are moving towards in fact, they announced their first offshore wind auction by the end of the year. They announced the terms for that auction just a couple of weeks ago. That means that the Philippines is on course to become the first emerging and developing economy within the APAC region to roll out offshore wind at scale, which I think is a really exciting update. We've also seen Vietnam really strongly endorse the role of offshore wind within its economy. So we saw an update to their power development plan and the setting of ambitious offshore wind goals, they're looking also to run their first auction at some time in the near future. We also saw that Japan passed a bill to allow development of floating offshore wind within its exclusive economic zone. And essentially, this bill sets out the blueprint and really fires a starting gun on the deployment of floating offshore wind within Japan at scale. And so I think that's a really exciting development, which will be followed by the detailed regulatory framework. We also saw Brazil pass its relatively long-awaited offshore wind bill just at the end of last year. Again, a really key moment for Brazil in its journey towards offshore wind. We've also seen the continual award of new licenses in Australia for project feasibility licenses. We also saw China again have a vote of confidence in offshore wind supply chain and invest even more into supply chain for offshore wind. We've seen that the UK is working towards its next auction and looking at CFD, contract for difference, reform to accelerate the permitting process. And we've also seen in South Korea, that the Special Act for the One-Stop Shop Bill, which is a bill which governs which sets up a one-stop shop for offshore wind, which involves permitting, etc. And we've seen that bill now passed, and South Korea move very rapidly towards its auction for offshore wind. So this is really exciting developments, and I just wanted to give you a snapshot of all the momentum that is continuing to happen, particularly in Asia, but also in those more mature markets in Europe. Next slide, please. So having discussed that positive momentum and discussed a bit about where the market is at this point in time, I now want to turn to looking at some of the enabling actions that we see for offshore wind going forwards. And we do set out these in a lot more detail in the report, but I wanted to give you a flavour of these actions that we see which are needed in order to accelerate offshore wind and maintain this growth trajectory. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, very strong momentum and positive progress, particularly in emerging markets. But there are currently 4 factors which we have identified as slowing the course of offshore wind's progress. So I mentioned already macroeconomic headwinds as a result of interest rate rises after both the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. We've seen commodity price spikes in combination with rising labour costs and logistical costs, and also higher costs of capital due to interest rates and risk premiums affecting project economics. We've also seen a lack of credible pathways towards meeting some of these targets. So there's a lot of very ambitious offshore wind targets, but we haven't yet seen in quite a few markets the credible plan for how to achieve those targets. We've seen some long-standing policy issues such as permitting and poor auction design hinder progress. And we've also seen increasing policy instability in some key markets. I'm going to go on to talk about these challenges in a little bit more detail now. We go to the next slide, please. So in terms of macroeconomic headwinds I spoke about, I think hopefully a lot of the listeners to this webinar, the viewers of this webinar, will be familiar with some of these effects, because a lot of these effects have been felt across different infrastructure sectors and have also culminated in this global cost of living crisis that many of us have been experiencing and living through. In this slide, we see central bank interest rates tracking from the 2021 to 2025 period. And across infrastructure sectors, as I mentioned, costs of borrowing money have increased and interest rates have increased. When it comes to offshore wind, because offshore wind is quite capital intensive as a sector versus other forms of technology, that means that a rise in interest rate can have quite a significant impact in the cost of capital. And that means that the project cost can significantly increase as a result of that interest rate or cost of capital increase. So that's the effect that we have been seeing over the last period. And that has impacted the sector quite considerably, as it has in other sectors, such as the construction sector, the rail sector, and many other large infrastructure sectors. Next slide, please. And then looking at some of these wider challenges, as I mentioned, we also have seen this rising volatility, which has impacted the wider sector. So looking at the impact that this has had on supply chain, some of the targets that have been set just do not have that pipeline and that visible pipeline of projects to then back up the targets. So in an ideal world, what you would see is a target for offshore wind and then a regulatory framework, an auction regime, which set out in detail how many gigawatts would be awarded each year. And that would enable investors to invest on the back of that information and have confidence that their investments will be met with returns. But what we have seen in quite a few markets is the setting of a target, but then not the setting of a detailed plan for the implementation of that target in the way that I mentioned. So that has led to some boom and bust cycles where, from a supply chain perspective, it's very difficult to invest on the basis of a promise without understanding how that promise will actually be met. Next slide, please. And this slide just talks to that point in a little bit more detail. So on the left here, you see the different offshore wind targets that we have in Europe. On the right, you see what the auction regime looks like, or what the award regime looks like in Japan. As you can see, it's fairly complicated, and each of the volumes which are auctioned in each of these auctions tend to be pretty low. By volume, I mean the amount of offshore wind that is auctioned at any particular time. So you can see that without having that regular drumbeat of capacity which is awarded through these auctions, you can see how it can be very difficult to then meet that target or have confidence in that target. And we are seeing, or we have seen, that effect. Next slide, please. And then looking at what that means, as I mentioned, from a supply chain perspective, it then becomes difficult to invest on that basis. So we have started to see, and GWEC has done a huge body of work on this topic. Across key supply chain components, we've started to see that there are potentially bottlenecks which could emerge, the risk of these bottlenecks in the global wind value chain if the conditions for investment are not improved. Next slide, please. Then coming on to some of the long-standing issues that I was mentioning. So I talked about auctions already, but then also looking at the topic of permitting or planning permission or consenting, to give it many names. So you can see here on the left the average number of years from offshore wind lease to full commissioning. In our research, we have found that that's 9 years is the global average time from award of offshore wind lease to full commissioning. That's not the time it takes to construct an offshore wind farm. That's not the time that it takes to develop it, but that's the time that can be taken for offshore wind to work through all the necessary permits that it needs to obtain in order to then get through that consenting process. So it's quite a scary number, and obviously that needs to come down rapidly, because the longer that a project is stuck in this limbo of planning permission, the more that capital is exposed to risk and the more uncertainty that creates in the investment environment. So simplifying permitting will have a major impact on investment certainty, and then also in reducing costs. And so for us, it's key that we work towards a simplified permitting regime. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, policy instability is increasing in some geographies. So what do we mean by policy instability? Well, this could be revoking permits. It could be different trade barriers which are established. It could be all manner of different things, but they all have an impact on how investors view markets and how risk is priced in. We actually at GWEC did a report very recently it's a few years ago actually now, on the topic of supply chain and looking at different scenarios along with Boston Consulting Group of how we can scale supply chain towards the amount of wind that would be necessary to meet a 1.5 degree trajectory from a climate change perspective. And we looked at different scenarios, so open door, increased barriers, economic downturn, and global escalation scenarios, and mapped the impact of trade disputes or trade wars also on some of these topics and how that impacted supply chain. And if you go to the next slide, please. We found that which of those scenarios that we actually go to has a major impact on the wind industry in terms of its growth, margins, and costs. And we found that only the open door scenarios, the scenario where there was free and open trade across the world, allowed us to get the necessary supply chain investment that we need in order to deploy the volumes of offshore wind that we would need globally as per globally agreed targets and a 1.5 degree trajectory. So we can also see the impact, and we have evidenced the impact that this kind of policy instability when it comes to trade specifically can have on offshore wind. And please do take a look at that report in a bit more detail if you'd like to. We also followed that up with a specific look at the APAC region and how the Asia Pacific region mapped out in terms of supply chain across these parameters too. Next slide, please. So, having talked about the challenges, the good news is that there are clear solutions to get offshore wind onto the right growth trajectory and onto the right pathway. And again, if you want to go into the report in more detail, we can explore these further. But you can see here the key actions that we, from a GWEC perspective, feel can help offshore wind get onto that right growth trajectory. So looking at the topic of redefining auctions for delivery, fast-tracking permitting, making finance fit for purpose, strengthening supply chains via cooperation and standardization, enabling grid and transmission readiness, and also reclaiming the public narrative on offshore wind energy. I'm just going to take a few minutes to go into these in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about auctions and tenders, and auctions remain a cornerstone for offshore wind development, mainly because for governments, usually the way to procure energy infrastructure is to go through an auction or tender process. So auctions have become, I would say, the primary way in which offshore wind is tendered. And they remain a cornerstone for offshore wind development. So as I mentioned, 56 gigawatts of offshore wind awarded in auctions last year. You can see here some of the dynamics at play. So projects can take 6 to 10 years to deliver, millions spent upfront in delivery of offshore wind and the development cycle of offshore wind. So from an industry perspective, it's really important that auctions do reflect the real delivery timescales and risks. And there have been notable high-profile auction failures, of course, which have exposed current issues in auction design. So we have done a lot of work here at GWEC on thinking around how we can improve auction design. And we've come up with some key recommendations and practical ways of improving this, learning the lessons of the last period, and also thinking about how in emerging markets we can really move forward and get a right first time approach in those markets. So what we're recommending is auction design based around better risk sharing models, such as two-sided CFDs, contract for difference, which are linked to inflationary indexes. Also, we're recommending that planning for auction should take place within industry frameworks that enable predictable project timescales and clear planning for associated infrastructure like transmission infrastructure. And we also would like to see critical associated infrastructure such as ports and grids treated as critical infrastructure and looked at as long-term investments in public assets. Next slide, please. And then coming to the other challenge they outlined and the solution that we see. So again, I mentioned permitting and the role that faster permitting can play in unlocking investment and reducing risk. You can see here that we have 5 key ways to speed up permitting, and this is highly achievable. We've seen we've seen some really good best practice emerging from Europe, particularly when it comes to Germany on the topic of onshore wind. And so there are blueprints there for how we can really accelerate permitting and make sure that we're able to reduce risk and ultimately reduce the cost to consumer of projects. So here, enacting clear deployment mandates, establishing single window permitting, having a principle of overriding public interest within the law to ensure that courts are valuing renewables expansion, designating permit-ready zones, so looking at publishing spatial plans which have predetermined sites and grid connections as well to enhance the confidence of developers, and also to facilitate early stakeholder engagement through a series of innovative digital-based stakeholder engagement procedures. So some really clear and practical examples there of how the industry feels that we can speed up permitting and thereby unlock more offshore wind and reduce that risk profile. Next slide, please. The other element I want to raise here is around supply chain, and there has been this race to the top in terms of turbine size. Actually, within the report that we've published, we look at the topic of standardization of offshore wind supply chain, particularly when it comes to manufacturing and also industrialization. And again, really would urge you to have a look at that chapter in a bit more detail. But essentially, the principle is about how we can invest in supply chain and take a more industrialized approach so that we can exit the arms race, which leads to a cycle of investment without then the associated return on investment. So again, please do take a look at the report for more practical evidence-based recommendations on this area. Next slide, please. And then I talked about grid transmission and enabling grid. One of the key elements here is around how we can get better grid planning and allow investment in grid concurrent with investment in renewables, and particularly in this context, offshore wind. So we've seen in some markets this has been completely out of sync with the requirements of offshore wind, and that's enabled or has created a situation whereby project development is ongoing and then the associated transmission infrastructure is not ready. And so we have recommendations here which are designed to really leverage grid and transmission infrastructure and ensure that that does happen in a way which is planned and coordinated with offshore wind build out. So looking at the role of national grid plans for offshore wind specifically, assigning clear connection responsibilities, investing in reinforcement and offshore hubs, and then accelerating permitting for transmission specifically. We also note the role of cost sharing mechanisms within the build out of this infrastructure in order to de-risk the build out of that infrastructure, because financing is a key piece of the puzzle here, and the need to enable anticipatory investment for these pieces of infrastructure. And then last but not least, also looking at the topic of supply chain readiness and ensuring that for grid specifically, we can enable the supply chain to scale up and build up the amount of grid which we'll need in order to meet that electrified future. So that gives you a flavour of the different recommendations that are within the report and the way that we see that offshore wind can be unlocked at scale here at GWEC. I've talked over in this presentation some of the global mega trends. I've also explored some of the developments that we see in the market and how the market has in the last year performed, and then looked forward to the future around how we see the market going forward at the global level and also from a regional perspective. I've highlighted some of the success stories and the key developments in key markets that we have seen from an emerging markets perspective. And then I've also explored some of the challenges as well as some of the recommendations that we have for putting offshore wind back on that growth trajectory and in enabling a right first time approach in those emerging markets. So thank you so much for having me for this presentation, and I'll hand back now for any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that overview. I'm sure the attendees are rushing to download and read your report. So, all right, we have a few dozen, well, about a dozen questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. You mentioned on the recommendations, one of the recommendations is to reclaim the public narrative on offshore wind. Can you elaborate a bit more on successful strategies or lessons learned from this?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the public narrative on offshore wind, we have seen the weaponization of the agenda against offshore wind at quite a significant scale. In the report, we do go into some detail on this, and we also map that out in one of the other reports that we published earlier this year. There has been a very concerted tide of disinformation, which has been is being faced by offshore wind. So within the report, we explore the disinformation piece, but we also explore the need for offshore wind to really own its own successes and to be confident about what we've achieved. So you've seen that at the beginning of the report in terms of the industrial and value case for offshore wind. So I think it's about both those things. It's about tackling that disinformation and also then looking at really reinforcing the fundamentals of offshore wind.
Wonderful, thank you. Um, So across the global portfolio of offshore wind coming online and considering the growing sizes of turbines, how large of a challenge is the quality control of turbine components, specifically thinking about the blades during the installation and early operation?
I think quality has to be at the heart of what we do in the industry. And in terms of the supply chain and its different component parts, as I mentioned, we do have quite a lot of evidence base around those particular component parts and the potential challenges or supply chain bottlenecks that we can see in each of those component parts, broken down in a couple of reports that I mentioned during the presentation. And when it comes to quality, I think that there does need to be a focus on quality more widely. And of course, the industry will work towards that focus on quality. So yes, it has to be at the heart of what we do.
Great, thank you. Question on permitting. So a few questions on permitting. Permitting timelines can stretch for many, many years, as you noted in your presentation. Can you speak more to how international models, for example, South Korea's OSS bill or the Japan EEZ bill, help speed up permitting? And what are some of the key lessons learned from those examples?
Yeah, so what we're seeing in both those examples is an attempt to centralize some of the permitting challenges. So particularly with the OSS bill, the one-stop shop bill, one of the key reasons for implementation of that bill is to bring together everything that is needed for permitting in a kind of one-stop shop. And this model has been seen in the past in Denmark. So Denmark has been one of the chief proponents of this one-stop shop model. And the idea there is that you bring together all the different authorities that you need to get permits from within one sort of clearinghouse, and that can streamline the process considerably. In some markets, for instance, it has certainly been the case that it's been anticipated that you would have to go to over 30 different agencies to get 30 different types of permits. And I don't know if anyone has seen the photos which did the rounds on social media a few years ago around the amount of documentation from different authorities that you needed to submit as paper documentation in Germany in order to permit a wind farm. But it was all laid out on a table and it ran to several tables length. So permitting, innovation in permitting, I think is really important. So having that mechanism to do that all in one place is a really key innovation, but also digitization of that process. So the more kind of reams of papers that you have to submit, obviously the more difficult that is also for one company or one organization to be able to go through. So again, we've seen some really good examples also coming through from Germany, which are more around this designation of special permitting zones, and also having mandatory limits on how long each local authority can take in order to permit wind farms. So there's many different really good examples of what we could do there. And actually GWEC and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, published a paper on exactly this topic, which looked at best practice in permitting innovation. So very happy to circulate the link to that as well as part of the notes for this.
Yes, definitely. That would be great. We can follow up with that. Another question kind of related to permitting, so you can just continue to expand. What are your thoughts on a single window permitting in the US, especially with state and regional differences between the three coasts? Each state has different permitting process. You know, what you were saying about 30 different agencies is really resonating with us. So what are your thoughts on this single window permitting in the US, given the three different coasts and difference between state and federal permitting?
I think that for federal countries or countries that have a federal structure, you need to obviously get that balance right between where you want to make decisions. The more joined up that you can have that decision making, obviously, the better. But I think it's about having that interplay and having consistency across those agencies and across the state and at a federal level. So certainly we've seen a lot of success where that process has been centralized, but obviously, as I mentioned, in federal countries, I think that needs to be tailored in order to have a system that works. So some kind of happy medium between those things, I think, is necessary. But I think looking at other federal countries, so Germany is in that way a similar kind of country in the sense that it does have very powerful states as well, and also how Australia has also tackled some of these issues. I think can be very instructive. So there are other models out there which really speak to that federal and state dynamic.
Wonderful, thank you. Um, you highlighted macroeconomic headwinds as a major challenge with the split of, countries from India to Korea. Are there proven strategies or financing models that globally have helped de-risk offshore wind investments during similar periods of volatility?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that the macroeconomic challenges that not just this sector has faced, but that the world has faced over the last period have obviously been relatively unique and quite extreme. So again, looking at that, at the COVID pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. So we are living through strange times in that respect, and that has an impact, as I mentioned, across different infrastructure sectors. I do think that when it comes to offshore wind in particular, the role of de-risking through the contracts for difference model cannot be understated. I think that does really allow that visibility of investment. It enshrines this principle of public-private partnership, and also ensures that consumers can get the best value for money, ultimately because of that de-risking process. So certainly, I think that model is something that we, from the industry perspective, really value and can see the benefit of. When it comes to the wider context around macroeconomic factors, I think it's also about considering things like the associated infrastructure that I've been talking about, things like permitting, etc., and how we really de-risk those processes. Because for every process during the development cycle, or every part of the kind of non-auction process, that adds an additional risk premium, which will be quantified. And I didn't touch so much on this in the presentation, but one of the other things that we're working on at GWEC is for emerging markets, particularly for emerging and middle income countries. Financing can be a key challenge. So even when you're tackling all of these risks and putting in place a mitigation plan, you're still kind of left with this feeling of residual risk as an investor. And that's something that we really think, particularly in those markets, we see a strong role for public-private partnerships, working with governments, but also multilateral development banks, etc., in order to unlock more innovative financing tools to reduce risk in those markets. So yeah, there's lots of good examples, I think, from our sector, from other sectors, and it kind of depends on the country that you're, or your perspective that you're asking this question from. But there are a lot of tools that can be utilized.
Great. This feeds well. I have a couple questions about reforming the auction process that I'll try to combine. So you know, thinking about de-risking different aspects of the project development really kind of starts with the auction. So thinking about what are some insights into auction reform that can ensure projects are more financeable and support their eventual delivery, and thinking about designing an auction process based around risk sharing, right, including coordination of transmission and permitting, et cetera, built together with the industry. What are some key steps in the auction reform? And maybe like a timeline for doing so. If you're developing an auction in coordination with the industry, how can you make it as robust as possible? And what are the steps and, suggested time to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, thanks for asking this question, because this is a very live topic that we're working on in a lot of the emerging markets that I mentioned in the presentation. So, from a GWEC perspective, we're really glad to be able to work really collaboratively with some of those countries and with the industry in those countries to propose workable solutions on the topic of auction, not even reform, but putting in place an auction system that, as I mentioned, works from the first time. And because of those auction failures that we've seen, I think actually from the industry point of view, we've learned a lot during that process, and I think governments have learned a lot as well. And it really is about getting that better balance between risk sharing and how we can de-risk that process. So there are different ways in order to do that. There's different methods within the auction which can allow you to do that, and different suites of levers that you can pull. If you are going towards a two-sided CFD model, then ensuring that is inflationary index linked is a good first port of call, and ensuring that the right criteria are in there to ensure that within that auction you're going to get that reliability that you would want to see as you build out the first projects within your country will be really important too. In the report, we actually go into a lot more detail on this topic and look at also the role of different performance-based criteria within that as well. So ways that governments can also be satisfied or have comfort also that their objectives will be met. Yeah, I really encourage you to kind of look into what we say into the report in a bit more detail on those topics as well.
Great. All right. I think we have time for one last question. And we'll turn to supply chain. You had a slide showing bottlenecks of critical minerals and components that go into offshore wind. And it looked like concrete was a major bottleneck. I think on the pie chart had like a 0. I don't know if if we can scroll back like several slides to this one. But basically, with concrete being a major bottleneck, one, that we're interpreting that graphic correctly, how is this overcome and what are lead times for concrete? Realizing that concrete is needed in almost every construction or major industrial project. So yeah, this global level criticality, like why concrete is 0.
Yeah, I think let me just check the
Oh,
representation
that
of
means no global bottleneck risk.
that means no
Okay.
bottleneck.
Okay.
So I think we've got a good level of concrete, but in general for this this slide and this information on this slide, I think one of the important things to remember here is that even on the topic of critical materials or critical minerals, I just want to put this in context, because this is within the context of the supply chain for wind. And for these critical materials, I think what what we really want to emphasize is that this is a very different paradigm to a paradigm that you would use, or a way of thinking that you would use for these materials if you were thinking about the thermal generation sector, for instance. So when we're talking about rare earths, for instance, the amount of rare earths that is needing to be utilized in wind is very small in comparison to that. You need a very small amount of those materials in order to manufacture. So the materials themselves also are different in terms of their characteristics um, versus energy generation technologies or energy sources like gas, because with gas you can obviously turn gas on or off. So the concept of resilience and of the supply chain for these components is quite different, and that's just what I want to emphasize at this point. But having said that, yes, it is correct that across these different components that we see here, there may be bottlenecks if we do not invest or put in place the right policies to allow investment in these particular components. So we can see here critical materials on the left, key components, then assembly, etc. And what we're doing at the moment from a GWEC perspective is really looking at what this mapping is on a regional and country level basis, because hopefully something that came through very strongly in the presentation is the need for international collaboration across these different components and across the wind supply chain. So we've done a great deal of mapping, for instance, on what the APAC supply chain can look like using these principles of international collaboration. But also we're just about to kick off a project which looks at this from an America's perspective. And I think what's really important and what's interesting about the sector is that despite this trend for geopolitical uncertainty that I'm seeing, we're actually seeing a lot more partnerships being forged on these topics that are represented in these slides. So if we look at the recent ASEAN summit, there was a bilateral partner or a multilateral partnership within the ASEAN grouping agreed on offshore wind, which encompassed some of these supply chain factors. So I think that's a really exciting development, and one that speaks to what's in this slide, but also speaks to the ability of offshore wind to be able to enable that international collaboration as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for elaborating on this and further about the supply chains. Yeah, thank you. I was gonna, if we can pause at this slide. So thank you so much for your presentation, and a reminder to folks to download this report. I guess I'll give you all a moment. We will scan this QR code together and download it. And great. So next slide, please. So thank you all for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and the presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Our next webinar in the series will be on Wednesday, July 30th. Anne Murphy with Inspire Environmental will discuss benthic habitat research for offshore wind. And on August 13th, we will host a webinar about how offshore wind contributes to domestic energy security. You can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out past webinars in this series on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. And again, if you would like to request a topic or a speaker for this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our events page. Thank you again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.